Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a text that takes a hard look at the constant storm of political allegations in India and asks, is it all just random noise, or is there a deliberate strategy at play?
So let's just start with that big question right up front. When you see this endless cycle of accusations in politics, is it just chaos, or is it actually a calculated plan designed to achieve a specific goal?
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to follow the source material's roadmap. First, we'll talk about the unending noise of allegations. Then we'll get into the two main strategies the text outlines, the thousand lies theory and projection. After that, we'll touch on a few other historical examples it brings up, and we'll wrap up with a big question for you to think about.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, this constant echo of allegations. The source really wants us to think about what all this noise is actually doing.
So the analysis kicks off by pointing out something we've all probably noticed, what it calls a relentless rhythm of corruption accusations, right? It says the focus is almost always on these huge defense deals or big corporate issues.
But here's the central argument of the text. This is not just politics as usual. It's a conscious, two-part strategy. And the goal? To chip away at what the source calls the government's biggest asset, its reputation for being clean.
So let's break down that first part of the strategy. The source gives it a pretty memorable name, the thousand lies theory.
You know, the idea here is incredibly simple, but also pretty powerful. The text argues that if you just repeat a big, simple accusation over and over and over again with enough force, eventually that repetition starts to feel more real to people than the actual complicated truth.
And the source points to the Chowkidar Chor Hai campaign as a perfect example of this in action. It's short, it's catchy, it's a slogan designed to get stuck in your head, completely separate from whatever the courts might eventually decide.
And this gets to a really interesting point the source makes. The objective here isn't to win a legal battle. It's about winning the story. It's about narrative capture. The idea is to skip over all the messy facts and just leave voters with a feeling that there's widespread corruption.
Okay, that leads us to the second part of this strategy, which is maybe a little more complex. The source identifies it as a psychological tactic it calls projection.
So what is projection in this political context? Well, the source defines it as a classic move of deflection. Basically, you accuse your opponent of doing the exact thing that you or your party have been linked to in the past. It's a way of turning the spotlight away from your own history.
The main case study the text uses to explain this is the Rafale fighter jet deal. It notes that all the attacks from the opposition were laser-focused on the new contract for 36 jets, the one signed by the NDA government back in 2016.
Now, this timeline is absolutely key to understanding the author's argument. It draws a really sharp line between two different phases. First, the long, drawn-out negotiations for 126 jets under the UPA, and then the completely separate deal for 36 jets finalized under the NDA.
And right here, this is the core of what the source calls the projection strategy. It puts two things side by side. On one hand, it cites investigative reports alleging that a middleman got millions in commissions during the UPA's negotiation period. And on the other hand, you have the opposition's accusations of corruption leveled against the deal signed years later, in 2016.
But there's another layer to this. The text calls it the leak factor. It points to reports claiming that during those earlier negotiations, confidential documents from the Defense Ministry were actually illegally obtained by that middleman. The implication, according to the source, is that the whole system was compromised back then.
Now, to really build its case, the source doesn't just stop with the Rafale deal. It reaches back into history to pull out other examples, suggesting that this isn't a new phenomenon.
I mean, it goes way back, all the way to India's very first general election in 1952. The text highlights allegations that were made at the time surrounding the defeat of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, things like claims of a coordinated conspiracy, and even accusations of electoral fraud.
Then the source brings up this massive figure, 3.32 lakh crore rupees. What is that? Well, according to the text, that's the total value of loans that were written off between 2004 and 2014 during the UPS time in power.
And the argument here is that these bad loans, these NPAs, weren't really out in the open. The source alleges that they were effectively hidden from view using a special accounting term, restructured loans, and that the true size of the problem only came to light after the Reserve Bank of India did a formal review.
So, after laying all of this out, the theories, the case studies, the historical examples, What's the final takeaway from the source's analysis? Where does this all lead?
The author's final point is that this goes beyond normal politics. They frame it as a form of political warfare, where the main battlefield is public perception. The big lie is the weapon to create outrage, and projection is the shield to hide from your own history.
And that really leaves us with a final and pretty challenging question. For all of us, as citizens, when we're bombarded with these powerful, catchy, and really simple slogans, how do we cut through the noise? How do we take the time to check the facts and really understand the full timeline of what's going on? It's something to think about.